Welcome back to the plenary, everybody. I hope you've had an enjoyable and fruitful morning. This morning, when I opened the conference, I deliberately didn't go into detail about the projects because I felt that was for you to discover in your workshops, and I hope that's what you've been doing this morning. I would like to say a very special thank you to Lorraine Leeson for coming to present to you today. Lorraine hasn't been very well, but has made a huge effort to come, and then had the unfortunate experience of being stuck in Frankfurt for quite a long time. And if any of you have ever been stuck in Frankfurt Airport, it's not fun. So a very special thank you and welcome to Lorraine. And the reason that we decided that this should be a plenary presentation is because many of you will not be experts in the field of sign languages. It's a very specialised area, but particularly for our national contact points, in your countries, you will know an organisation or an individual or someone in the ministry who has responsibility for this. And we felt, therefore, it was important that we shared this with you in plenary. So I'm going to hand over to Lorraine, but before I do that, because I know people are asking about arrangements for after, so we'll do that bit first. Lunch will be outside, ready for you when this presentation is over. And the buses, if you can congregate in the little, the little passageway that joins the ECML to the main street, my colleague Margaret will be waiting for you 2:20 to walk with you to the Hotel Weitzer, where the bus will be waiting to take you to the Meerscheinschlüssel. You will also be provided with transport back to the Weitzer this evening. The bus will leave the Meerscheinschlüssel at 9 o'clock. So there is transport available for you to come back. Okay? So once again, thank you, Lorraine. The floor is yours.
Oh dear, okay. Very good. Forgive me, I wanted to begin by using a little bit of international sign, particularly because I know some of the colleagues who have been involved in our ProSign project are going to join us online. So a big hello to everybody out there. It's such an honour to be able to present a little about the work of the ProSign project to you here today. The project was, as I understand, the first project focusing specifically on sign languages that has been supported by the European Centre for Modern Languages. And before I say anything else, I have to say what a wonderful experience it has been for our project team. The welcome, the engagement, the support all the way through the 4 years that we have been working with you has been phenomenal. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so let's get started. So let me tell you a little bit about the project. The project, when we were initially beginning to think about putting together a proposal with a great deal of encouragement from Professor David Little, who's also in the room, we had originally thought that we might start by looking at the teaching and learning of sign languages in primary or second level education. But we very quickly came to the conclusion that that would not be viable because, unfortunately, the social context for sign language users is so unstable, if we want to use that word about it, because the recognition of sign languages is so highly variable from state to state across the Council of Europe territories that in many places, sadly, there's still no access to sign language in primary or secondary level education for deaf children. And so the teaching and learning of sign languages as languages of instruction or as languages on the curriculum was not going to be possible at this time in the kind of manner that we wanted to undertake. So instead we thought about where the teaching and learning of sign languages was best established, and we agreed that given that the education of sign language interpreters particularly, but also the development of sign language teaching and learning programs for professionals working with deaf communities had over the past 2 decades become more established across a broad range of countries, that this would be a good place to start. Not least because in those contexts, we had deaf professionals working, teaching their languages to students who were in turn going to go and serve the deaf community and increase access to full citizenship, for want of a better word, for deaf people across Europe. So that's where we started. Our project team included Tobias Haag from Switzerland, Christian Rathmann from Germany, and Beppie van den Boogaard from the Netherlands. While we had all known each other in advance of this project, it was actually the first time we'd had the opportunity to work together, and we're very glad we did, because we have had an absolutely wonderful time collaborating. Christian Rathmann is himself deaf, and I can't tell you how important that was for our project, because what we were effectively doing was setting out to garner support from deaf communities across Europe. This wasn't just about trying to bring together 30 or 40 teachers of a language. This was about pushing forward increased recognition of the importance of sign languages in teaching and learning at tertiary level education. So his contribution was incredible, because the other 3 of us are all hearing people. We're the people who have traditionally told deaf people what they can't do, that their languages are not real, and that's not the way we wanted this project to be. We wanted to make sure that we were starting from a point of inclusion, and that meant when we were talking about the languages that this project would be delivered in, that a sign language had to be the working language of the team. So we chose International Sign. Now, I have to be very careful here and say International Sign is not a language, but what it is a lingua franca that allows people who know different sign languages to operate effectively, more or less, once they've had the opportunity to engage with each other. And given that we were bringing on board people who had a great deal of experience of teaching and learning, deaf people who had travelled internationally and who were often leaders politically in their own countries around the recognition of sign languages or research on sign languages, that meant that we were going to draw on an incredible repository of cultural and linguistic know-how. And so we had International Sign as the predominant language of our team and of our workshops and our network meeting. And we also sought to ensure that any content that we had available on the website would be available in International Sign, with the open and ongoing invitation to colleagues to take that material and translate it into their own national sign languages. So there would be this trickle-down multiplier effect. Actually, should also say, when we talk about sign languages, in many countries people tend to say, well, they're minority languages. There aren't that many deaf people when we're thinking about it. But if you think about the general rule of thumb that people apply, they say 1 in 1,000 people are sign language users, are deaf sign language users. And it's been suggested by a colleague in Sweden that for every 1 deaf sign language user we have, there are 10 hearing sign language learners. That very quickly adds up. So if we have 1 million deaf sign language users in the Council of Europe territories, that means we have 10 million hearing sign language learners, more or less, maybe more, which is actually, when you think about it, the population of Finland and Ireland combined. Suddenly you think, what, this is a population that we need to be thinking about and we need to be responding to more effectively. And so, excuse me, within all of this context, we operated. If we think about the outcomes that ECML have set in terms of the projects that they want to support, we obviously at the very beginning, like many of you in the room, had to think about, well, how do we measure up? How can we respond to these principles and goals? Well, in terms of the promotion of an inclusive, plurilingual and intercultural my goodness, this is worthy, isn't it? Pedagogical approaches to the teaching, learning and assessment of sign languages. What we wanted to say is, you know what, there are many, many sign languages across Europe. Some of them are well supported. In some places, there are very well-established programs. In Sweden, for example, they've been training sign language interpreters since the 1960s. In my own country, since the early 1990s. But in places like Luxembourg, in Malta, in Cyprus, there is no interpreter education. So what does that mean in consequence for deaf people? So we were thinking not just of the immediate consequences of our project, but the medium and longer term effects in terms of social participation and inclusion. We also wanted to initiate and support dialogue between professionals of language and subject-specific domains. And we did this by ensuring that we made known that we were going to have these wonderful events here at ECML and actively encouraging the deaf sign language teachers who we knew were leaders in their fields, in their countries, to contact their national agencies to let them know that they would be interested in information about the ProSign project as that unfolded. And we also drew on our wonderful associate partners excuse me, to disseminate information broadly to deaf people across and deaf organisations across Europe. We also, of course, wanted to create awareness of ECML and ECML's vision. And one of the ways that we could do this was by going out and talking about our project, obviously, but also by bringing these expert deaf sign language teachers here to Graz. And that was phenomenal. It was absolutely wonderful to see Michael asking deaf colleagues from across Europe to contribute in little signed vlogs about their experiences while here at the network meetings and the workshops. We also ensured that, because actually when we started out with our project, our goal was to look at CEFR in terms of CEFR as used in the teaching, learning and assessment of sign languages for particular purposes. And we had thought that there had been enough work done at A levels and B levels in order to focus in on the C level competencies. But we were wrong on that, and it became very clear to us early on that we had to take a step back and start by building capacity from the ground up. So one of the things that we did was we made podcasts available in International Sign about CEFR, about how do you describe adequately what's A-level competency, how do you differentiate between competency levels. And we had something like 40,000 hits on the website. So I think it's safe to say that the message about CEFR got out there, the message about ECML went out there, and people began to know and reference the work of ECML over the past 4 years as a result. And as I said, we also have this social justice component. We want to make sure that we are engaging actively in the promotion of appropriate standards for language learning that will then enable sign language learners to potentially pursue interpreter education, which in turn will have meaningful impact on the lives of very many deaf people across Europe. So our participation, we have a map there. We had participation from far and near. One of the things that we had done to try and benchmark awareness around the use of CEFR was to conduct an online survey, both in International Sign and in English, and we had responses from, across this range of jurisdictions and indeed further afield. I believe we had a respondent from Hong Kong, which was interesting, though maybe not particularly immediately relevant at the time. In terms of engagement, as I said, we wanted to ensure that we were coming to the deaf community on the deaf community's terms. We wanted to bring a discourse around pedagogy and assessment framed within a Council of Europe and ECML-driven approach, in sign language with people who are often plurilingual in many sign languages, but who may not be able to access English in written form or French in written form. And so for us, we really did have to keep thinking about how do we ensure that we're making this content maximally accessible? How are we making sure that everybody has a say in what we're doing and that we can bring that forward in a meaningful way and then report back to the community at various points? One of the things that we realised also very early on was that this project had hit home at a really good point in time. We had so much interest in the project. We had something like 30 places for our workshop, but we had 100 people who were contacting us saying, but we want to come too. We will pay for ourselves to come. And we talked with the fine folks here at ECML who said, that's fantastic, but you're never going to fit them in. This is not going to work. So we liaised with our colleagues here at the university in Graz, and they very kindly offered us some space so that we could run a pre-workshop conference. And we had about 100 people self-financed to come to that. That work allowed us to frame the conversation that we had here at our workshop meeting. And given the response from our participants in the conference and the workshop, we decided that come hell or high water, we would find a way to have another conference. And so we did. We had another conference at Hamburg University, where we had over 150 participants, and approximately 95% of those were deaf sign language teachers. And we had this most wonderful exchange of information. And they worked with us in defining and refining the ways in which we phrased our final descriptors and indeed tested them and validated them. I've just really stuck in a few pictures to demonstrate how some of this works in action. So if we jump to the next one there, Michael. I also wanted to say that, of course, this wouldn't have been possible, this process, without very fine sign language interpreters and deaf translators supporting us. All of the content that's actually on our website was translated by two fantastic German deaf translators. So it's no mean feat, as our colleagues here at ECML will tell you from having to work through the hundreds and hundreds of video clips that we sent to them and asked them to upload in appropriate fashion to the website. It's no mean feat to handle content multimodally. A big challenge is the fact that sign languages have no written form. So, again, when we're thinking about how do you go from descriptors that are codified because they've been tested to engage with a very broad multilinguistic community and then harness that data and put them back into English, which was the other working language of our project team, but ensuring that the English doesn't become the dominant language in all of this, but rather that the language with no written form remains the central point of reference for our deaf colleagues. Well, it meant that we had, as I said, a lot of engagement, but also it required us to ensure that when we had the sign language versions of the descriptors, that we then back translated into English from them, so that the final version of our descriptors that you will see on the website are in fact the translated document rather than the original document. So it's a time-consuming process, but an essential one in order to ensure that the sign language community are centre and front in this process. It's just a little shot from our network meeting here in Graz. So, as I've said then, we created materials that colleagues could use along the 4 years of the project, podcasts that sign language teachers and sign language teachers in training could access. That's really important because one of the things we learned at our workshop from colleagues was that even though they may have had a sign language department housed within a linguistics department or a language education centre where many spoken languages were used, because in many countries there aren't adequate interpreting supports put in place in universities, Deaf colleagues don't have incidental opportunities to have conversations with hearing colleagues about how they approach their work. So even though I might be a deaf colleague working in a department or a wider, say, school where CEFR approaches are used, where people are expert in assessment, I may not have the opportunity to draw on that because of the lack of provision of interpreters and other linguistic barriers. Access to training as teachers is quite limited still in many places for deaf teachers of sign languages. So that was another impetus for us to ensure that we had resources that would support understanding of the pedagogical principles that underpinned our approaches. And indeed, it's one of the reasons why we have a document that suggests what one might think about in terms of the assessment of sign languages. And so over the life of the project, I think it's very fair to say that we have built some capacity. It's been a very interesting journey where, for example, 4 years ago at our very first conference, we had colleagues talking about how they were thinking about applying CEFR influenced approaches to the teaching, learning and assessment of sign languages. And by March of this year, we had colleagues presenting on how they had tested their hypothesis in practice. So we had colleagues from the Netherlands saying, you know what, when we thought we were teaching to C level, but actually when we verified it, that wasn't where we were getting to. We were getting our students to a good maybe B2 level competency after 4 years. And that was the good students. So what about the ones who are hitting B1 and how can they be ready to interpret? That's not going to work. So it's really also allowed not just for capacity building, but also a reanalysis of the expectations that are brought to bear on the teaching and learning of sign languages and what that in turn will mean for practical things like fitness to practice as an interpreter. And we're delighted that also across the life of this project, the work that we have done here has fed into a document around the minimal threshold competencies required for sign language interpreters in the European Union. And that document was launched in the European Parliament in December 2013. And so, again, it's about this evidence-based approach to managing expectation. And then from there, hopefully, we'll be able to say, okay, and now how do we bridge the gaps that exist? So there's a huge body of work that remains to be done. And here you get a kind of small, but you'll get the idea of the way the content looks on our website, where you can jump into the overview of the tools that we have, and you can click on a particular button, and there you get a drop-down menu with options. And for every descriptor, the more prominent component is in sign language. Again, one of the things that we're emphasising to our colleagues across Europe is that they should take these and they should localise them, and they should tell us about that we want to know when these materials have been translated to other sign languages. Another really important thing that I forgot to mention, and I would be murdered if I didn't say this, is of course that we were starting out at a point where some countries had already been working with CEFR in their teaching, learning and assessment of sign languages. So our colleagues in France, our colleagues in the Netherlands, our colleagues in Germany and ourselves in Dublin had been approaching the teaching, learning and assessment of sign languages from this perspective for a number of years. And so we could draw on those resources too and filter them into the final documentation across the life of the project. Another interesting outcome is the fact that, again, this isn't a direct result of our project, but I think the fact that the project happened when it happened, it coincided with a point where many people in many countries were talking about the need for sign language teachers to have a forum to come together. And the impetus created through ProSigns led to that happening. in an ad hoc way, through our conferences and the workshops and network meetings. And so actually last year, or maybe it was even the year before already, a formal association of European Sign Language interpreters has been established. But it's really interesting to see that the people leading that are the people who have been really critical to our work in ProSign. So that's very promising for the next 4 years of work as we move into ProSigns 2, I'm delighted to say. Another really important point, and then I will stop because I'm conscious of time and you're conscious of dinner or lunch, is that we have, beyond the impact that I've mentioned, is the fact that we have had fantastic support from a number of organisations. We've been working with the European Union of the Deaf, with the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, as I've said, this new European Association of Sign Language Teachers, but also we have been engaging with other key bodies, including the colleagues who work on Europass, who have just said to us in the past week or so that providing ECML is happy to sign off on our descriptors, that they will incorporate them into Europass. So that's a wonderful, wonderful outcome because it raises awareness of sign languages, even in very subtle ways, and it makes it legitimate, if you like, for people to say, I have a sign language as a working language. And we know that this runs in parallel to sort of pan-European recognitions of sign language. For example, the European Parliament has passed resolutions on sign languages back in 1988 and 1998, and the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly did the same back in 2003. So it's just about implementing these recognitions in very practical ways. We can jump another one. And that's another just still shot from what our website will look like. I really hope that you will go and engage with it. I hope that you'll find some information there that may be of use to yourselves potentially. But because I see the time is ticking away, I'll jump straight to the acknowledgements and say very big thank you to a very long list of people, including the wonderful ECML team, our associate partners who've been phenomenal, Moscow State Linguistics University, who became one of our partners, our cooperating partners over the life of the project, the municipality of Graz, who were very kind in hosting a number of receptions for us, Frank Hayworth, who has been our wonderful advisor, as well as colleagues here like Nadia Grabik, David Little, our wonderful fellows and interns, one of whom is in the back of the room. Thank you, Niamh. And thank you to the More Dots project for allowing us to share her with you. We do appreciate that greatly. As I've said, our interpreters, our translators have been wonderful. And fundamentally, the ECML member states who supported this work. It could not be done without you. And as you've learned, this is how we applaud when we are using sign language. So our team in the last slide, maybe if you could just show that one, is applauding you. So thank you very much. We'll say thank you.
Lorraine, that was really, really interesting. And I believe lunch is waiting for you outside. Enjoy.